She stood in front of the gleaming Rolls-Royce, hands tucked into the pockets of her faded cardigan. Her shoes were worn, her hair loosely pinned back, and her purse, barely clinging to life, looked decades old. A salesman glanced up from his phone, looked her over once, and smirked. "Ma'am, this isn't a used car lot." She blinked, confused. "I'd like to take a look inside," she said softly. He laughed, loudly enough for the others to join in. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This isn't a photo booth." They didn't know. They couldn't have known. But in less than an hour, they'd be standing in front of the same car, begging for their jobs, from the son of the woman they just humiliated. Margaret stepped through the glass doors of the Rolls-Royce dealership, with a soft smile and eyes that had seen decades of sacrifice. The smell of fresh leather and polished chrome met her like a wave, but she wasn't intimidated. She was curious, hopeful, and maybe a little nervous. She clutched her modest brown purse close to her side, its frayed strap hanging on for dear life. Her cardigan was hand-knitted, faded at the elbows, and her shoes, practical walking shoes, bore the quiet wear of someone who'd walked miles more than she ever complained about. She took small, careful steps toward the showroom floor, where the majestic cars rested like sculptures behind velvet ropes. Every head in the room turned toward her, not with welcome, but confusion, amusement, and disdain. One of the younger salesmen nudged his colleague and whispered something under his breath, prompting a chuckle. Another pretended to adjust his tie, but his eyes scanned her like she was a misplaced item in a luxury store. Margaret didn't flinch. She simply smiled politely and approached the nearest pedestal, where a sleek silver ghost gleamed under the spotlights. She reached out a hand to touch the glass information stand when a voice, clipped and dismissive, interrupted her. "Excuse me, ma'am. Customers aren't allowed to touch the display." She turned to see a man in a tailored suit, arms crossed, face twisted in a smirk. "Of course," she said quietly, stepping back, hands clasped together. "I was just wondering if you're looking for the service center, maybe?" he interrupted. "That's down the street. We don't sell parts here." Margaret blinked. "No, I'd like to see the cars. I'm interested in purchasing." The words felt strange, even in her own mouth. Not because she was lying, she wasn't, but because it had been so long since she'd said anything for herself. The man raised an eyebrow, visibly trying not to laugh. "Right," he scoffed, motioning for another salesman to come over. "We have someone here who's lost," he said loudly. "She thinks she's buying a Rolls." Laughter bubbled behind a desk. Someone snorted. One of the receptionists pulled out her phone and subtly started recording. Margaret stood there, cheeks burning, but still didn't raise her voice. Her eyes scanned the room, not for help, not for validation, but for someone who might simply listen. Instead, she found mockery in every glance. "Ma'am, this is a private dealership," the second salesman said, now standing beside the first. "These vehicles are by appointment only. Unless you've got an invite or a check in hand, I'm going to have to ask you to step outside." I do have the means," she tried to explain, reaching into her purse. But the man took a step back, holding his hands up like she was drawing a weapon. "Security?" he called toward the back. "Let's not make a scene," the first one muttered, though they were already making it. A guard, tall, broad-shouldered, earpiece glinting, walked over. "Is there a problem here?" "Just an elderly woman with a dream," the second salesman quipped, not even trying to hide his grin. "She says she wants to buy a Rolls." The guard looked Margaret over, then sighed, clearly annoyed at being summoned for something so trivial. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to come with me." Margaret's hand froze inside her purse. She slowly pulled it out, revealing not a weapon, not a check, just a phone. An old one, the kind with large buttons and a scratched screen. She looked up at the guard, then at the salesman, and something in her eyes shifted. "I didn't come to cause trouble," she said softly. "I just wanted to do something for myself today." "Well, maybe start smaller next time," the first salesman said, turning his back on her. "Like a used Hyundai." The laughter that followed wasn't just unkind, it was cruel. It rang through the pristine walls like a bell of judgment, echoing long after Margaret had stepped back toward the door. The security guard didn't shove her, but he made it clear she needed to leave. "Have a good day," he said, tone flat. Margaret stepped outside into the afternoon light. blinking against the sun. Her heart pounded in her chest, not from fear, but from something heavier, a lifetime of silence. 100 moments like this, endured quietly. She looked down at the phone in her hand. It had one number on speed dial, the only one that mattered anymore. She pressed it. It rang once. Then a familiar voice answered, calm and warm. Mom? She looked back at the building behind her, the one where she'd just been laughed out of, ridiculed, humiliated. Her eyes glinted. He's still there, right? She whispered. There was a pause on the other end. Yes. Margaret nodded. Good. She hung up. The guard had already returned inside. The salesman had moved on to their next targets. A young couple dressed in designer clothes, all smiles and perfume. No one noticed her anymore. But in less than 60 minutes, they would all remember her. Every word, every sneer, every joke they thought she was too old or too poor to understand. And they'd learn something they never expected, that the quietest people often have the loudest stories, and sometimes they own the very floor you're standing on. Long before the glass walls, the marble floors, and the glistening emblems of luxury, there was a 2-room apartment with peeling paint and a leaky faucet that kept Margaret up most nights. The mattress on the floor wasn't soft. The heating barely worked in winter, and dinner often came from cans lined up on clearance shelves. But inside that cramped space lived something grander than wealth, a love so deep it filled every cracked corner and echoed down every hallway of their modest life. Margaret had been only 23 when she became a mother. The father was gone before Ethan's first birthday, too restless to settle, too scared of responsibility, and too blind to see the treasure he left behind. Margaret never chased him. She didn't have time. She had diapers to change, bills to juggle, and 3 part-time jobs to manage. She cleaned office buildings at night, taught piano to neighborhood kids on weekends, and worked as a school secretary during the day. Sleep was a luxury, but Ethan was a blessing. From the moment she held him, she promised herself one thing. Her child would never feel small in the world, even if they had to build it from scratch. Every dollar she earned was stretched like a miracle. Ethan wore secondhand shoes, but never walked without purpose. Margaret made sure of that. She taught him to greet janitors the same way he'd greet CEOs, to listen more than he spoke, and to help others even when no one was watching. They'd spend evenings reading library books about inventors and builders and dreamers. She never told him, "That's impossible." Instead, she'd ask, "What would it take to make it real?" Even when she was exhausted, legs aching, hands raw, she stayed up to quiz him before exams or sew patches onto his backpack so he wouldn't be embarrassed at school. Ethan grew up watching her stretch pennies into possibility, and he learned early that dignity was something you wore inside. By the time he was 14, he was already building websites and fixing neighbors' broken electronics for extra cash. Margaret never understood how the circuits worked, but she praised his curiosity, nurtured his ideas, and told him over and over, "Your mind is your inheritance. Use it well." When he got into MIT, she cried for 3 straight hours, tears of pride, not worry. She didn't know how they'd afford it, but somehow they did. Ethan worked 3 jobs on campus. Margaret took a loan she didn't tell him about. They made it work. And then, something changed. During his sophomore year, Ethan launched a startup from his dorm, a diagnostics tool for electric vehicles. At first, it was just a class project. Then it gained attention, then funding. By the time he graduated, he'd sold it for $12 million. Margaret couldn't believe it. "It's too much," she whispered when he told her. "It's just the beginning," he said. Over the next decade, Ethan would go on to build an automotive software empire, revolutionizing in-car tech and luxury navigation. He was a genius, no doubt, but he never forgot where it started. Every year, on his birthday, he'd call his mother and say, "I'd be nowhere without you." When he purchased the luxury dealership chain, including the very one Margaret had walked into, it wasn't for prestige. It was for her. "You always loved cars," he told her once. "I remember how you used to point at the old Cadillacs and smile. You never said you wanted one, but I knew." Still, Margaret never took advantage. Not once. Ethan bought her a home, but she kept her old couch. He offered her designer clothes, but she preferred sweaters she'd mended herself. She donated most of what he gave her. Not because she was ungrateful, but because humility had always been her compass. She never asked for status. She just wanted to live quietly, honestly, and with grace. And so, when she decided to visit the dealership that day, it wasn't to test her power, it was to surprise her son. She had been saving quietly for years, not because she needed to, but because it meant something to her. Buying a car with her own money, her own choice, was symbolic. A reminder that she was still independent, still capable, still more than just the mother of a billionaire. She'd picked the Rolls-Royce not because it was flashy, but because its name reminded her of class, of elegance, of something she never thought she could have. She imagined surprising Ethan at dinner, handing him the keys and saying, "I did it." But the world had different plans that day. She'd never told the staff who she was, never announced it, never pulled rank. That was the whole point. Margaret believed people showed their true hearts when they thought no one was watching. And they had. Every smirk, every whisper, every dismissal. It wasn't just about her. It was about anyone who'd ever been looked down on for wearing plain clothes, for growing old, for daring to dream outside of their tax bracket. She walked out of that dealership not as a scorned customer, but as a mother who had just seen her life's greatest test unfold. And it wasn't hers to pass, it was theirs. Ethan didn't need an explanation when she called. He heard the tiredness in her voice, the old quiet sadness she rarely let show. He knew something had happened. And though she never asked him to come, he already was. Not because she demanded it, not because she was weak, but because once again Margaret had taught someone how to stand up, simply by refusing to stoop down. The dealership sat quiet under the late afternoon sun, unaware that history was about to be written in its glass halls. Inside, the staff had gone back to their routines, laughing, chatting, pretending the incident from earlier hadn't happened. The two salesmen who had escorted Margaret out were now entertaining a couple who wore designer sunglasses indoors, gushing over champagne-colored upholstery. The receptionist, who had smirked and recorded Margaret's humiliation, scrolled through her phone, trying to decide which filter would go best with the clip before she sent it to her friends. The security guard leaned against the back wall, half asleep, his earpiece still in but his mind somewhere far away. They had already forgotten her. That was the worst part, how easy it was for them. Until the engine purred outside, like a storm wrapped in silk. A blacked-out Rolls-Royce Phantom, its grille polished to a mirror's defiance, turned into the lot like it owned more than just the asphalt beneath it. And in truth, it did. The driver's door opened with a hushed click, and Ethan stepped out. No entourage, no bravado, just presence. Immaculate charcoal suit, no tie, watch peeking from beneath his sleeve, the kind of man you didn't recognize from tabloids, but from the way other people reacted around him. The first to notice was the younger salesman. He stood still for a moment, mouth parted slightly. Then he nudged the other. Whispers spread like sparks on dry grass. The receptionist nearly dropped her phone. Someone gasped, "Is that? It's him. That's Ethan Locke." Chaos tried to dress itself as calm. One salesman raced to straighten his tie. Another grabbed a bottled water and wiped invisible dust off the counters. The manager, red-faced and sweating, burst from his office, barking orders under his breath. "Look alive! Smile! Act like professionals!" They scrambled like roaches under sudden light. Ethan didn't glance at any of them. He walked past the automatic doors, barely registering the salesman rushing to greet him. The one who had mocked Margaret stepped forward with an ingratiating grin. "Mr. Locke, welcome back. We weren't expecting you today. Can I get you anything? Espresso? Still water? We just got the new Cullinan in." Ethan didn't stop walking. He didn't speak. His eyes swept the room once. Then they found her. Margaret sat on a bench just outside the entrance, under the shade of a blooming jacaranda tree. Her posture was calm, her hands folded gently in her lap. She wasn't crying. She didn't even look upset. She looked finished, like someone who had just crossed a bridge and burned it behind her. Ethan stepped through the doors and walked to her without a word. She turned her head slightly, offered him the smallest of smiles, and gave a single nod toward the dealership. That was all he needed. He turned and went back inside. The mood shifted again, from awe to fear. Ethan's stride was measured, purposeful, and silent. Without waiting for permission, he stepped behind the front desk and tapped on the receptionist's keyboard. The manager sputtered, "Sir, is there something we can?" Ethan raised a hand. Silence. The projector on the showroom ceiling blinked to life. The lights dimmed slightly. A live feed connected to the internal security system filled the wall. Rewind. Pause. Play. The dealership watched themselves, only this time from the outside. Margaret entering. Her hesitation. The moment she reached for the display. The salesman closing in. Every sneer, every comment. The laughter. The security guard escorting her out like a trespasser. The cruel one-liners. The smirks. The receptionist recording from behind her desk. It all played out in real time, unedited, like a mirror none of them had asked to face. By the end of the clip, you could have heard a pin drop on carpet. Ethan looked at no one in particular. "Tell me," he said, voice calm but sharp enough to slice. "At what point did you think this was acceptable behavior?" No one spoke. "Do you know who that woman is?" The first salesman stammered. "Two didn't know she was related to?" "You shouldn't have to," Ethan snapped. His voice didn't rise, but the room felt smaller now. "You don't treat people with decency because of who they are. You treat them with decency because of who you are. And what I've just seen tells me everything I need to know about you." He turned to the manager. "Fire them." "Sir?" The two salesmen, the receptionist, and that security guard. Faces blanched, mouths opened. Pleas started to form. But Ethan didn't want to hear them. He pointed toward the janitor who had stood awkwardly in the corner during the whole spectacle, mop still in hand. "You," Ethan said. "Did you offer my mother water?" The man blinked. "Yes, sir." She looked tired. No one else was helping. Ethan nodded once. "What's your name?" "Luis." "You're now floor supervisor. Report directly to the new general manager I'm installing tomorrow. Your pay just tripled." Gasps rippled. Luis stood frozen. "But sir, Ethan offered the smallest of smiles. "Don't thank me. You were just being decent." He turned back to the others. "That's all I ever expected." One of the fired salesmen, face pale and clammy, tried to protest. "Please, sir, we didn't mean..." Ethan cut him off with a look. "You treated a stranger like she was disposable. Now you're realizing she wasn't. The lesson here isn't about who she is. It's about who you chose to be." He walked back toward the doors. Everyone watched in stunned silence. Outside, Margaret rose as her son approached. He held out a key fob, platinum trimmed, the iconic double R crest glinting beneath the sky. "It's yours," he said. She took it quietly. "I had saved up for it," she said, almost sheepishly. "I wanted to surprise you." Ethan's face softened. "You did." And then, with the same grace that carried her through 1,000 unseen struggles, Margaret stepped into the Rolls-Royce she had once only dreamed of. The doors closed with a whisper. The engine hummed to life. Inside the dealership, every eye was glued to the scene as she pulled out of the lot, slowly, proudly, with Luis holding the door for her like royalty. Not a word was spoken until the car disappeared from view, but in that silence, something permanent settled into the walls. A shift, a reckoning, a reminder. Because they hadn't just underestimated a woman in a cardigan. They had underestimated the power of quiet dignity, the weight of kindness, and the strength of someone who never needed to raise her voice to change a room. And as the dealership stood frozen in the shadow of what had just happened, one truth lingered heavier than all the rest. The most powerful people don't need to announce themselves. They simply show up, and the world remembers.